Welcome to the first episode of the Fabled Academy podcast. I am your host Alex, and today with me is Charles Dunn from America. We want to talk about the fatigue strategy. Charles, thank you so much for taking the time and welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Talk about my favorite style of deck, fatigue decks.
Yeah, so fatigue is a strategy that is well known in Flesh and Blood, but when you are starting out, it can be kind of intimidating to get to know it, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's a strategy that I think really preys on players who may be less experienced playing against it. It definitely takes a certain kind of strategy to understand it and play against it efficiently.
Yeah. I remember a really nice game from last year's Battle Hardened in Belgium. It was actually the finals, and that was an Oldham mirror match. So it was about a 2 hours game that I watched, and until eventually one of them ran out of resources. So when did you really discover the fatigue strategy as your favorite?
Yeah, it was with Oldham. Obviously, he's kind of the poster child of a fatigue deck. And it was after Starvo, Bravo Star the Show, hit Living Legend. And so I was looking for a new deck, right? And, I figured Oldham is kind of like 2/3 of Starvo, right? He can still play the Earth and Ice cards. And I was just messing around with, a variety of Guardian strategies. And what happened to me was I was playing just a local armory. And I ended up winning a game by fatigue against a friend of mine who was playing Dash. And was doing like the construct nitro mechanoid strategy. And so what ended up happening was like I was trying to be aggressive, and then they constructed the mech suit. And I realized like, I guess I just have to block out. And I just kept on blocking out, and I ended up winning that game, which from what it seemed like unwinnable because I was just able to like perfectly block out. And that got me thinking, is like, hey, what if I just like built a deck to do this from the start, right? I didn't like pivot into it midway through the game. I just like said right off the bat, I'm going to just be blocking and defensive and fatigue you out and run you out of cards. And so I made the updates to the deck and tinkered around with it. And I just started winning a lot. and the deck was doing really well into a wide variety of decks. And I knew I was onto something. And yeah, so from that point, I just like really got into that mode because it was working for me, and it was beating up on a lot of different decks, a lot of different players, and I've been running with it really ever since.
Yeah, you are also known for a really unique strategy, running a deck that is mostly known for being an aggressive deck, a really powerful deck with a lot of damage output, but you actually figured out how to build this deck, Briar, into a fatigue strategy and take down the US Nationals of 2023 with it.
Yeah, that was a real interesting one. Briar, throughout her pretty much entire history, has always been the aggressive deck. People look to use things like the Embodiment of Lightning that she can make, and just the really powerful aggressive Runeblade cards to really push damage and be a very aggressive strategy. Rosetta Thorn, of course, a great weapon that empowers that kind of strategy. But turns out Briar also has other text. She has the ability to make these embodiments of Earth, which makes her really good at blocking. And so I was able to put together a deck that really capitalized on creating embodiments of Earth. And also she's an Earth hero and can run Crown of Seeds, which in my mind is like the strongest piece of equipment ever printed in Flesh and Blood. Because it really enables these fatigue strategies in a lot of different axes that we can I'm sure we'll dive into at some point here. Yeah. But yeah, Crown of Seeds was really good, and that made the deck really strong, and I was able to win nationals with it.
Yeah, that is definitely a story that is taken down into the history of Flesh and Blood, and that we want to talk about in a little bit more detail and later when we are going into the podcast. But now for the beginning, let's actually talk about the fatigue strategy, what it really is, and what also is maybe the problem with the fatigue strategy when you are starting to play Flesh and Blood. And beginning with that, I want to bring up a topic when I am at my locals and we have new players there. I even consider myself still a new player because I still learn a lot. And I'm from Germany here, so when talking about fatigue, I try to translate it into the German language, of course. So I was looking it up in the beginning of how can I explain to other people what fatigue is and how to actually pull it off. And it is still sometimes a little bit difficult, but from what I've found is that when talking in German, it has two different ways that you can describe in Fatigue. And the one way to describe it is to make your opponent get a little bit of sleep. So you want to make them sleepy. That's the one way to describe it, which I think is like maybe only the side of the viewer on the game, not actually the player playing the game. Because watching games that are mostly into the Fatigue is, I think, not really entertaining, at least when the strategy is really well known. But there's also another way to describe it in German, and I think that is the better way to really enhance this feeling of playing Fatigue, and that is draining off the energy of your opponent. So slowing them down and trying to make them run a marathon, despite them wanting to make, maybe when they have an aggro deck, you wanting to make a sprint, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really great way of describing it, is really making the opponent play in the way they're not prepared for. As you described, running a marathon when they're built as a sprinter. I think that's a really good way of describing Fatigue, because really the essence of this kind of strategy in Flesh and Blood is it's not playing my one hand against your one hand and then we draw a new hand. It's really playing my entire deck against your entire deck and saying that, I'm going to run through every card in your deck and it's not going to be enough. And that's really what the Fatigue deck is built to capitalize on, and a lot of other decks aren't. And so you're really making them play a different style game than they maybe were preparing to fight.
Yeah, and when looking at this Fatigue strategy, it's also important when beginning the game to look at the wide variety of strategies available, right? So I think when I look at the Flesh and Blood decks, mostly in three categories. So the more towards the aggro side decks that, maybe you are trying out when you are beginning the game, like with the ninjas. And then, of course, there are the mid-range decks, which I think a lot of decks can be built mid-range, if I'm not mistaken. But then there's also this Fatigue strategy, which is on the opposite of the spectrum, where, like you described it, you are not really looking to just see it from hand to hand, but rather your whole deck.
Yeah, definitely. I like the class. I think the idea of aggro, mid-range, and like even hardcore control comes from a lot of other previous card games. That was some of the terminology we used, and I think it somewhat translates into Flesh and Blood, but Flesh and Blood has a very different game structure. And so kind of the way I think of this, similar to this aggro, mid-range, and Fatigue strategy, is on average, how many cards does the deck want to block with? Right? You draw 4 cards per turn, and aggro decks generally don't want to block with any of their cards. They can efficiently use every card in their hand for the most part. Mid-range decks generally want to block with 1 or maybe 2 cards, and then kind of throw 1 or 2 cards back on attack. And then Fatigue decks are perfectly happy blocking with 3 or 4 cards every single turn in, turn out, and only maybe having 1 card on the back end to maybe attack you with a weapon or something. And so that's kind of how I think of these different, like the different spectrum of decks. And of course, there's nuance there, and there's, some decks can sometimes not want to block and sometimes want to block everything. But like on average, that's kind of how I think about the breakdown of decks.
Yeah. And I think you can also pull a parallel here to other games. Like you just said it, when coming from another TCG, you may be even familiar with these strategies. But in Flesh and Blood, they work a little bit different. And there are also a lot of the viewers out there who are playing other games. Maybe they are playing board games or they are playing digital games. And at least in digital games, there is a character known as the tank. And I think that is also a good way into describing what a Fatigue deck wants to do. And when looking at the picture of the heroes, like Oldham, for example, you can clearly see that he is a tank.
Yeah, definitely. Always about the defense, because you want to be blocking with a lot of cards, so you end up having a lot of defensive tools. You have shields in a lot of cases. So yeah, definitely the tank is the role closest to Fatigue decks.
So then let's come to the problem with Fatigue. I don't really think that from a pro perspective, when you're deep into the game, you have a lot of knowledge that Fatigue is a problem. Or do you view it another way?
No, I think at the highest level, a lot of players have the idea, like they understand that Fatigue is a real strategy, and they understand that these decks have a place in the metagame. Some players still might not, like the deck, but some people don't like decks like Kano that just play on a very different axis, or don't like Illusionist. And I never think that really serious players are going to take too much issue with a style of deck like this. But certainly, I do think it has a bad reputation among, I guess let's say the newer players, right? The players who maybe have not played hundreds upon hundreds of games of Flesh and Blood at a competitive level.
Yeah, and I think that is also when learning the game, you're really learning these core mechanics like I can attack with one card, I need to pitch with one card, and if I want to, I can block damage. But then there comes the time when you take these decks that you try out in the beginning. Let's say you are playing Ira, or you're playing Dory at the beginning, and then you're facing a Guardian. Or you're facing a Fatigue deck that is not really... You don't really see at the first glance that it is a Fatigue deck. And this can also happen in another format, not only constructed, right? This can happen in sealed, this can happen in draft. And the understanding of what these mechanics do in Fatigue and how they are pulled up is really difficult in the beginning, I guess. I have still a lot of problems detecting it myself, even though I know the basics of Fatigue now. But yeah, what do you think when beginners are looking at Fatigue?
Yeah, and so I think the reason why it sort of has this bad reputation among players, and players don't really like it as much, is kind of twofold. One is that it beats them a lot, and it's really good against players who don't really fully understand it, and so it ends up they lose to it a lot, and it's also as part of that, it's kind of frustrating to lose because they're losing for a long period of time. Right? They're playing a very long game, and so like if you actually look at the minutes, minutes on a clock. How long are they spent losing? They spend a long time losing. And that feels bad. That is a very valid thing. Whereas if you're playing an aggro mirror, right, it's over and done within 5 or 6 turns, and that's the game. Win or lose. Here, a Fatigue deck makes you be losing for like 20 turns, and that just will naturally feel worse. Even if it only counts as one loss at the end of the day. And I think the second part that makes players not really like it is because it is harder to understand, and sort of by definition, the newer players are not going to understand it as well. As you mentioned, when you learn Flesh and Blood, you typically learn how to play one hand, right? You need to think about which card do I pitch, which card do I attack with, which card do I block with, and that's really where a lot of your mental bandwidth is going. And it's a hard game. I do remember when I was learning how to play Flesh and Blood, I had to just like stare at a 4-card hand for a long time trying to work out the possibilities. And so just even thinking on that level, it's a hard game. And when you sit down against a Fatigue deck, they basically tell you, you need to play perfectly on the hand-to-hand basis. And then also you need to think about the long game. And I'm asking you to think about something else when you're already a little bit overloaded with trying to play optimally on just that one hand. And so it's really putting a higher burden on a player, and that's very hard to do, and some players don't like that because the kind of the baseline game, right, the one hand at a time kind of game is already a lot to process and a lot to try to play optimally. And so to add this extra layer of thinking about Fatigue, thinking about the long game, does it makes the game harder, and that's part of why it is really strong against players who aren't really prepared to deal with it in that way.
Yeah, it's and not only the Fatigue style decks, not only fatigue the deck, they also fatigue the player, right?
Yes.
So it is a lot harder to analyze in the end what went wrong and what you can do better the next time. I remember when I learned to play Art of War in Fire, it was a learning curve that I can see growing and that I can see that it's getting better from game to game. But when playing against Fatigue, or even when I try to play a Fatigue deck, like let's say Bravo, for example, it was a lot harder to learn, and it is a longer process of actually getting an edge when you are playing against other opponents. And that also can be frustrating, like you said, but what those players can do to counter Fatigue or how to learn Fatigue is actually the topic that we want to talk about next. And maybe we can start with
Sure.
how to play Fatigue in the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when you're thinking about playing Fatigue, it really does start with deck building. right? You need to structure your deck in such a way that's going to be your game plan. And the way I think about building a deck for Fatigue is you really need three main things. And so the first thing you need is probably the most obvious is like good defensive tools, and good defensive tools that line up against what the aggressive decks of the current format are playing. So if aggressive decks are playing a lot of like small go again attacks, you might need a lot of small defensive things like sink belows and maybe that all you got defense reactions to counter them going pretty wide. If instead they're playing really big, tall dominate attacks like say Azalea, then you're going to be wanting to play bigger D-reacts like staunch responses or things like that, or unmovables. And so first thing is you really need to have a good suite of defensive options that line up well against the decks you're expecting to face. The second thing I think you really need is the ability to punish an opponent whenever they take a setup turn. So one of the really important concepts of a Fatigue deck is that you draw 4 cards per turn, and you can have an arsenal, but you can only like block or defend with cards out of your arsenal if they're a defense reaction or an instant or something like that. And whereas most aggressive decks can play their card out of arsenal, so they can more consistently have 5 card hands to attack you with, and you need to make sure that you have enough ability to defend with 5 cards to kind of match what they're doing. Otherwise, you're going to be taking too much damage if you're trying to block 4 cards against their 5 every other turn. And so whenever your opponent does take some time to maybe set up or takes a turn off to arsenal a card, having some ability to capitalize on the space that they give you, because just attacking them for like 4 or 5 damage doesn't really do anything to further your game plan. You need a way to like gain life, or a way to maybe throw a disruptive attack at them so that they need to block, which further disrupts their ability. So this is why things like Sigil of Solace are really good, and things like in the Briar deck, the ability to threaten, create an embodiment of Earth, which isn't you need to attack to do that, but it gives you defensive ability on the back end. Whenever they're trying to attack you back, you've kind of gained value whenever they take a turn off to maybe set up or do an arsenal. And I think the final thing that you really need in building a Fatigue deck is just a strong way of recurring value. Generally, this comes from having a good weapon, which is why Guardians have always been the premier Fatigue deck. They have kind of the biggest weapons, because naturally, every one of your blocks is generally going to be less, like on a per card basis, than what your opponent is attacking you for. So if they're spending 1 card to attack for 4, right? They play a Scar for a Scar, or a typical aggro card. Your average defensive card is going to be blocking for less than that. Most of your defensive cards block for 3. And if they play like 1 card to attack for 7 or 8, right? They throw an individual big attack. You need to spend 2 or 3 cards out of your deck to block that. And if you don't have a good weapon or a good way to constantly recur that value, you're actually going to get fatigued yourself by blocking. You're going to run out of cards because they're being more efficient. And so this is why something like Ultim was just the pinnacle of it, because he had Rampart of the Ram's Head, which lets you kind of block for 1 damage for free every turn. Same with Crown of Seeds, also lets you block for 1 card. When I say for free, I mean it doesn't cost a card out of your deck, right? You can pitch a card, and then you can draw that back later, right? You don't lose a card. It doesn't go to the graveyard to make that block. And then, of course, he had a really good weapon. And, of course, his hero power, if you do the Earth React, also blocks for 2 without losing a card out of your deck. So Ultim just had really everything going for him in that avenue. So I think if you have those 3 things in mind, right, you have the good defensive tools, you have the ability to punish an opposing setup turn, and you have a good value engine, then that's really the recipe of making a good Fatigue deck. And then it's just about lining up your defensive options with what your opponent is attacking you when you're actually in game, punishing their off turns, and then getting that recurring value. Kind of that's a deck building checklist, and it's a gameplay checklist for how to play a Fatigue deck.
So when just setting up the board, there are clear signs that I can detect a player wanting to play Fatigue, right?
Definitely. I think something like Rampart of the Ram's Head. If you're playing against the Bravo who plays Rampart, that's a big sign. Crown of Seeds is not legal right now. In Classic Constructed, there's no hero that can play it. But back in the day, that was definitely one of the signs as well. Or any kind of like, you often see warriors play Decimator Great Axe, because Decimator Great Axe is really good on that third bullet point, that recurring value. It's hard for you to block it. If they're playing Decimator Great Axe, that's probably a sign of a Fatigue deck as well.
And is there really the meta for the Fatigue decks, or is it just like the meta is always for Fatigue decks?
I'm a little biased. I think the meta is always the case because that's just the style I like. But I think it's always worth considering. There are certainly metas that are more favorable to it, and metas that are less favorable to it. There are decks that are really good against Fatigue decks, and these are decks that don't rely on the normal attack you with my 4-card hand, and then attack you with my 4-card hand again, and then over and over again. They're decks that are things like Illusionist. They set up a board state of auras or dragons, or some other kind of a recurring value. They're not just sending an attack at you, and then that attack goes to the graveyard. Or something like Dash, who does like the pistol items, the induction chamber and plasma purifier, to set up a really strong recurring attack. Those type of decks are really good against these Fatigue decks. So if those decks are popular, then Fatigue decks are a lot weaker. But if a lot of people are playing decks that are just about going, sending a hand to attack you, things like ninjas, or a lot of some of the brutes. Rhinar is kind of an exception. Rhinar is really good against Fatigue because of Intimidate. But things like KO in the current meta. Even a lot of the warriors, who you see with the rise of Kasai. Definitely if Rangers are popular, right? We had Lexi and now Azalea is good. These are decks that Fatigue is quite good against. So you do need to have a little bit of metagame knowledge to know if it's right to play these style of decks. But I think the style of decks that Fatigue is good against are always going to be fairly popular. So I think it is generally a safe choice, for me at least.
Yeah, it's definitely something that you need to prepare for when joining the Flesh and Blood game, and also when getting to know the different decks, the different style of decks that are out there. What does a Fatigue player look like?
A Fatigue player? I don't know if we have a camera here, but it looks like me. No, I think you mean like the type of person who wants to play a Fatigue deck.
Yes, I think like when stepping into a tournament, it is clearly that everyone has their favorite decks, right?
Sure.
Just like you have your favorite deck into the Fatigue strategies, but I think it's a style that you really need to be drawn to, right? Either you are a player that really wants to pick the strategy that is the best at the moment, but what kind of players hearing this out there, not very familiar with Flesh and Blood yet, might be interested in the Fatigue style?
Yeah, I think a lot of players who come from other games where they play very control or defensive decks that thrive on those long games. Players who like, maybe in other games like drawing a lot of cards and having a lot of options. I think those type of players are really drawn to it. I've played other card games before, and I typically gravitated towards those defensive, longer game style decks, just because I liked thinking about the game, kind of like a step back and think about the whole game and the whole deck versus the whole deck, and not just about how do I optimize the chance of, getting this one, optimize the damage on one turn, or the chance of hitting your right, your right curve in other games, or something like that. People who like to kind of maybe step back and think about the bigger picture of a game. I think those type of players are going to be drawn to Fatigue decks, because that's really what you're doing, is you're thinking about the long game, not just the short game.
Yeah, and there is a really interesting part about it, right? I think as a Fatigue player, you really have to make the long strategy work. And in Flesh and Blood, there's a unique way to do it when actually pitching the cards that you are using in the game. And you can set up your late game with this. And I think that's a really interesting part about it. You can think about this early game, the mid game, and the late game. And with a Fatigue deck, you typically have a lot of big resources in the end still. When playing Bravo, for example, you can still crippling crush your opponent in the end and having enough resources to pull it off. When in Fire, you typically run out of wars in the end, right?
Exactly, yeah. I remember when I was playing Oldhim Fatigue, and when I was first bringing this to a calling, and I was talking to a friend about the deck, and the way I basically described it was, I'm going to make a bet with my opponent when I sit down that we're going to play 15 turns of this game. Because 15 turns, if you draw 4 cards per turn, goes through your 60 card deck. So that's like what we call first cycle, the first time through your deck, before you get to those pitched cards. So my bet with my opponent when I sit down is that we're gonna play this game for 15 turns, and you will not do 40 damage to me. You can do 39, but you're not gonna do 40. And if you don't do 40. Now we've gotten to the point of second cycle where opponents pitched the cards. And as you mentioned with something like Fi and most other decks in the format, now after 15 turns, their deck is mostly blues. It's mostly weaker cards. It's cards that they pitched the first time. They're out of their power cards. They're out of Art of Wars. They're out of things like Bloodrush Fellows in Brutes. And now my deck is just better than yours. I'm not going to take any damage because you're out of power cards. And now it's just a matter of, winning the game with my better deck against yours, because you're never going to do any more damage to me. And even if I'm only at 1 life and you're at 40, you are not going to push that last point anymore because your deck is out of good cards.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think exactly this is what holds back the Fatigue experience in the beginning, because it is so much fun to just pull the trigger and throw the Crippling Crush right at the beginning when playing Bravo, or just pulling the trigger and out of warring the whole turn with +1 at every attack. That is so much fun. And with Fatigue, you really have to keep your endurance strong, right? You are playing the long game and you are trying to make a long game and not a really fast game. So you need to think about this and not only throw these attacks out there and hope they hit your opponent for a lot of damage.
Yeah, it's all about things like Art of War. Yes, you could maybe play Art of War on the first turn you draw it, and maybe maybe you have a good turn, right? You spend your whole turn, you attack for, I don't know, like 16, 17, something like that. Like some good amount, and you do some damage. But if you had waited, if you had maybe arsenaled it and, waited for the perfect setup, maybe you could have done 20 damage or 25 damage or some other slightly bigger number. And you need to have that patience when you're playing against a Fatigue strategy to make sure you get the absolute most damage out of your power cards. Because if you spend them and you don't get the most out of them, then it's gone, right? You don't get that card back, and you're going to need to find some other way to push through that damage.
Yeah. So when we are talking about the Fatigue strategy, you mentioned a really interesting part about it, and that is the weapon. But I think there's one more part to it where the Flesh and Blood community calls it the fridge. And I think that is also a really important part about it when facing these Fatigue decks, right? They not only have this power to block a lot of cards in their deck, but they also have this additional resources on the board.
Yeah, a lot of these decks have a lot of good armor. And whether that be things like 2-block battle-worn armors, things like Grasp of the Arknight from Briar, or Crater Fist in Guardian. These are really important parts of the strategy, mainly because one, they just give you more effective health, right? If you just look at all of your armor and add up the numbers, you realize that Guardians start with 10 more life. Then it says 40, but they really have 50 because of their armor. But what is also important is covering important breakpoints. If your opponent attacks you with a, say, red Snatch attacks for 4. And if you don't have a D-react like Sync Below or Fate Foreseen, you could you might be only able to block that for 3, and then suddenly they get to draw a card, and maybe they can push more damage through. And having just the option to cover important attacks and not use too many cards on it, like I can block 1 card plus a 1 block armor. I mean, that's useful for every single deck, right? That's not a fatigue exclusive thing, but I think it really does highlight, or it's really part of the power of fatigue decks, because the way that those aggro decks overcome fatigue is by pushing these breakpoints and leaking in little points of damage here and there when they can, and just having a lot of options to cover up those attacks and block out important attacks is very valuable, more so in fatigue than even in your standard aggro decks.
And also, these heroes are meant to play fatigue, right? It's like, you look at them and you look at the cards that are possible to play in the deck, and you just smell that it is fatigue when getting to know the game.
That's certainly true for Ultim, yes, and often a lot of times with things like Bravo as well, just Guardian in general. Yeah. That's definitely true.
There's even a new hero out there now called Victor Goldman, right? And he is kind of a fatigue hero too.
Yeah, he definitely has a lot of the good clashing and blocking cards. I definitely think lend him to that more defensive strategy for sure. He's a new hero though, so we don't have a ton of experience, and so people still be feeling him out, but I think that is definitely the avenue that is going to be popular with him.
Yeah. And I mean, the dangerous part about playing against fatigue is that fatigue is not only able to block a lot, but they are at some point very dangerous in putting out a lot of damage and these threatening on-hit effects, and like with Crippling Crush or with these Frostbites from Oldham, but also I think these the Golden Sun, right, in Victor is also an example of that, which makes it really interesting to play fatigue. It's not only like you try to run a marathon and run your opponent out of resources, but at some point you can really push the value that you have in being a more endurance deck.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the big points that you need when you're thinking about building a fatigue deck is a way to really attack the opponent and punish them whenever they give you space. If they, try to set up an arsenal or don't pressure you, coming back with a Crippling Crush is a pretty good way of punishing that, or sending these big Guardian attacks. Or even in other decks, if it means like healing, which doesn't seem like it's offensive, but it kind of furthers your own game plan. These are really important parts. And also whenever you're playing, well, Bravo specifically with Crippling Crush, just being able to pitch that early, and then later in the game, once you get to that second cycle, and most decks are, they've run out of their power cards, maybe their turns are a little bit weaker than average. If you have enough of a life total buffer, you can afford to just take some hits because you have a Crippling Crush in hand, and they are probably out of defensive tools. And you're going to send that back and just take over the game. Rather than fully wait for them to run out of cards, you can kind of push the issue yourself.
Yeah. So when looking at these heroes, and you see those heroes that are meant to play fatigue, there are also these heroes that at first glance are not meant to play fatigue, and you can build them into fatigue, like the Briar deck that you played at last year's US Nats.
Yeah, definitely. I think I mentioned a bit earlier, but I do think because Briar, well, it's such a powerful hero, had really 2 different hero powers. So many people really focused in on just the one half, the embodiment of lightning, and thought, oh, free go again, I'm going to play non-attack actions. And to be fair, most of the Runeblade class cards really supported that strategy. You had a lot of cards like Sonata Arcanix, which was clearly meant to be played offensively with a mix of these attack and non-attack actions. And Rosetta Thorn, of course, was a great offensive tool that rewarded that play style. But the embodiment of Earth part, even once it was errata to only be the first time per turn, really should not have been discounted in the ability for Briar, and I think it really was. Until I kind of put together the more fatigue style Briar deck that really checked all those boxes of meeting the criteria for a fatigue deck. It had great defensive tools, right? When you get an embodiment of Earth, your defense is off the charts. Basically, every card in your deck now blocks for 4, which is just so much higher above rate than you would normally expect. You had ways of covering break points if they sent attack for 4 or 5, and you need to really block it, and you wanted to do it efficiently. You had Crown of Seeds. You had a few other cards that helped you to use those resources well. And it also had a bit of a surprise factor. I think, because just regular aggressive Briar was still a rather popular deck in the metagame, and in fact, in that top 8 of US Nationals last year, there was a regular aggro Briar deck as well in that top 8. And so a lot of people, when they just sat down and you say, yes, I'm playing Briar, and that's all they know, right? They don't, they don't have a reputation like someone like I do. And they just see Briar, they're going to assume, okay, this is an aggro matchup. I need to trim down to 60 cards. I need to go fast. I need to, be prepared to play a quick game plan. And then you show up with, 67 cards in your deck and remembrances and defensive tools. And they're just not equipped because they thought you were an aggro deck. And then you're not. And you take them by surprise. And you can get some free wins for that because they kind of set up their deck incorrectly.
Yeah, the surprise factor is something to consider, of course, and that is, I think, the goal of so many players out there. They want to build that one deck that surprises everyone at a tournament and takes it to the top because no one is prepared for it. And I really like this metaphor of players trying to break through the meta and getting an edge with a new deck. But it's also a dream that can come true, like you showed in the last year at US Nets. What is really like the one core point when building those decks and not falling into this pit when trying to build a deck and it's really crappy, but then realizing, oh man, this is a really good strategy. I should focus on it more.
Yeah, that's tough. I think I've kind of been chasing that for a while where it's like I always want to break the meta, right? I think, as you said, a lot of players want to do that. They want to find the one deck that no one else knows about and takes the whole tournament by storm. But it is pretty rare to actually do that. It's very memorable when it happens, but the sheer number of tournaments that are won by just, a standard deck, maybe with a slight tweak or slight variation, but, kind of a known quantity, is pretty high compared to a deck that is this brand new breakout. I think if you're really aiming to win a big tournament, like a Nationals or even a Calling or something else like that, with kind of an off meta deck, a surprise deck, if you will, I think the deck needs to be reasonably good. It doesn't need to be the best deck in the whole room, but it needs to be pretty good. But then you need to play it extremely well, especially for the higher level tournaments. You need a lot of practice on it. You need to play a lot of games in practice, and you need to really make sure you're playing smart and playing correctly into all the different matchups, because the element of surprise is it's really good whenever you know how to play the matchup and they don't know how to play it. But if you don't know how to play the matchup in the first place, then basically you're surprised by your opponent too. So yeah, you need to have a lot of practice with it. I think I had well over 100 games played with the Briar deck before Nationals, and so that was a lot of practice to really make sure that I knew the deck inside and out into all of the different matchups. I had my game plans. I was kind of really locked in. I think that's important.
I think that's also a really unique opportunity, right? Because in Flesh and Blood, when you are building those decks and you want to test those decks, like you said, you have well over 100 games with that Briar deck. But you also needed to kind of take it under the radar, right? You needed to play with players that don't like go out there and like, well, you know of this new strategy here, why don't try it out? I think that's really important, right? To have a testing group that you are fostering this mindset with, and that you are trying out different things with. We see this a lot in Flesh and Blood. I think that is really unique to TCGs in general.
Yeah, I definitely agree. TCGs in general do have always rewarded this kind of team structure where you have a group who try to build decks together and test them amongst themselves and limit the spread of these precise decks that they're making until the tournament that they're building them for. And that's especially true with kind of what I call the surprise decks or the secret decks, the decks that you're hoping to break the meta on. It's a real point of concern for these teams, and my testing team included, is, hey, what if we do find this deck? How secretive can we be? And I think there's a trade-off between how big the team is, right? As you add more people to a team and you have a larger testing group, on one hand, that's really good for having, just more people to test, more ideas, more eyes on your deck list. But it also means that if you do find something, it's more likely to get out to other people and become public. And you find a deck, and then somebody on the team plays it at a pro quest or something, and then they win, and then it gets the deck list gets published and people see it. It's just more likely for a surprise deck to get out, and so it's a big testament to when you do find the one good deck, or not the one good deck, but like the one deck for the tournament that you want to keep secret. Yeah. Trying to actually still maintain that element of surprise and is a struggle, but I think it's very worthwhile, especially when you can take people off guard and they're not prepared, like the case of Briar last year. One additional point on that is the weekend before U.S. Nationals 2023, there was a battle-hardened, I think it was in Atlanta, and somebody made top 8 with a similar version of this Briar deck. Oh. They made top 8 of the Battle Hardened, and then they lost in the first round of the top 8. They didn't win the Battle Hardened. But I was sitting at home terrified. Like, I was sweating. I was like, oh my god, this is terrible. Everything is a mess. This is the worst thing that could possibly have happened. For a tournament, I'm not even in. Like, I'm sitting at home watching this tournament, and I am freaking out because suddenly this idea is out there. But it obviously didn't end up, ultimately mattering. But yeah. It was that kind of like, I'm panicking because somebody totally unrelated to our team, they independently came up with this concept. Of course, our deck was slightly different. I think our deck was better, obviously. But there's a lot of different ways you can build it. But just the idea that this deck was out there terrified me.
Yeah. That's also, I think, the feeling that you describe in this moment is like, there is a time for these unique builds, right? When you are trying to build a deck that is not meant to fatigue or not is meant to fatigue in the first place, and then you are finding the seed in it and actually pull it off. There might only be this one tournament, right? Where this is the right time to pull the trigger and actually play this deck and win with it. But then afterwards, when everybody knows the strategy and how to detect it and how to counter it, then the time is already over. And I think from what I've seen is a lot of decks that win bigger tournaments are like this or can be like this. Not every time, but there is a time for a deck and then the time is also gone, right?
Yeah, I think it's borne out in the evidence that U.S. Nationals was the first weekend of that national season. And obviously I won with Briar. The deck list got out there. Everyone, not everyone, but a ton of people around the world probably watched that tournament and saw the deck in action and saw the power level of it. And then there was Nationals like 3 more weekends after that. This build of Briar did not win another Nationals. I don't even think it made top 8 at another Nationals. I could be wrong on that. But I know it didn't win any other Nationals. I think it was a very, very strong deck. And you could have taken it to a number of other Nationals and probably won with it. But the fact that it didn't kind of speaks to the fact that either players were more prepared for it. They had it on their radar. They had some ideas of how to play against it and maybe beat anyone who ended up copying my list and playing it. Or it was just a deck that people didn't have any experience playing as, and they didn't have the time to grind out, 100 games of practice with it before taking it to their own tournament. So it's kind of both ends, right? It's other people are more prepared for it, but also if you're not prepared to play it, then the time may have passed by the time
Yeah.
the deck list gets out there.
So after we talked about these heroes that are meant to play Fatigue and the special ones that are not meant but actually are pulled off to play Fatigue, I want to talk about the sealed portion of Flesh and Blood, because that is also a way of playing Fatigue, not only the constructed side. And last year's last limited season was with Bright Lights, right? And that was well known for Fatigue. Now we are with heavy hitters though, and a lot of things look different now.
Yeah, it's definitely a concept that comes up a lot in limited formats. I mean, constructed decks, you can build your deck with this in mind, and limited formats, you're more limited in your ability to build a deck exactly that way. But we did see that quite a bit in Bright Lights, because there was only one of the 3 heroes that had a weapon that could endlessly swing, and that was Teklavasa. And he was arguably the most popular hero in that limited format, because once you had an Evo out, he could just pitch a card and then attack with his weapon. Whereas somebody like Max or Dash needed to play items in order to give their weapon the ability to swing for like 1 turn, and not perpetually. They can't just constantly swing it. And this means that 2 out of the 3 heroes of that format didn't have that kind of recurring value that we talked about earlier from your weapon, but 1 hero did. And that meant that the meta for that limited format could kind of warp around. If you're playing against Teklavasa and you need to think about being fatigued out by his weapon, especially if you were playing Max or Dash, when you couldn't necessarily fatigue the Teklavasa. So that was a really important consideration in the previous draft format. And now with heavy hitters, it's still early on. I've not done quite as many drafts of heavy hitters as some others, and certainly not as previous draft formats. But here, every hero has, I would argue, a pretty good weapon by comparison, right? You've either got Mandible Claws, Centauri Sabers, or the High Riser. So I think every single hero, every single class has the potential to play for that kind of fatigue long game, because they all have good weapons. And then it just becomes a matter of building your deck in the right way and kind of structuring the game to get to that point, rather than just, I picked Teklavasa and you picked Max, I guess I can fatigue you.
Yeah, and then it also maybe even a worse strategy to just like make the biggest possible deck, put every card in it, and then maybe you are drawing less good hands than your opponent, and your opponent is throwing so much damage at you that you are not really able to block it out and come back with your weapon later.
Yeah, definitely. I think there is a strong strategy for draft that is literally just pick every 3-block card that is legal to play in your hero. Just like if it has 3 block, don't care about anything else, just pick the 3 blocks and then play every legal card that you can. That might be a good draft strategy. I'm not saying it's going to consistently 3-0 every pod, but I think you could do that, and you just ignore things that have 2 block until you have to pick them, of course. But you just pick every card that has 3 block on it, and then you try to block and swing your weapon every single turn. I think you can win some drafts and win some games just doing that very basic strategy with any of the 3 heroes, or any of the 3 classes rather.
But then there comes the overpower. That might be a problem.
Indeed. So luckily they, the designers of Flesh and Blood are very smart, and I'm sure they thought about this when designing the set. And then one of the ways they put in a kind of safeguard against this being the dominant strategy is you have an entire hero, Betsy, who is all about giving the attacks overpower. And overpower is, it disrupts the strategy. If your entire plan is to just block with 3 cards and then attack with my weapon every single turn, suddenly overpower says, well, you can only block with 1 of those, and you're going to take some damage. And if Betsy does that 3-ish times per game, your life total is gonna run out pretty quick.
Yeah, you can die to that pretty quickly, actually. But there's also another card in heavy hitters that you cannot really expect your opponent to play, because it is a rare, and everyone can play it. It's a generic, and that can really catch you off guard, right? It's down but not out.
Yes. Yeah, down but not out. I like that card a lot. It's a really cool design. I think it's very strong. It's obviously just a 3-block on the baseline, which I like 3 blocks a lot. But yeah, even if just giving anybody access to overpower, and if it's red, I think it's 8 overpower. That's probably going to push through quite a bit of damage into a lot of decks, especially if you're being more defensive and fatigue oriented. Then down but not out can be played in any deck and really push that over to break through your fatigue-based defenses.
All right, so now that we talked a lot about how to play fatigue, let's actually come to the part where we cover how to counter fatigue. What would you say? Like, how are we able to counter fatigue?
It's not possible to counter fatigue. You should just give up trying and let me win every tournament.
All right.
No, that's not actually true. There's plenty of ways to counter fatigue. But I had to advocate for myself there for a bit. No, so there definitely are ways of countering fatigue. I touched on a few earlier where some of these setup-based decks, often illusionists who build up a board state, are very good against it because fatigue wants to really block with all of your cards, and then and you're attacking with all of your cards. So we kind of trade off that way. But if you're deploying dragons, if you're deploying auras, you're actually forcing the fatigue deck to proactively clear them by attacking them. And that's kind of out of character for a fatigue deck, and it makes their defensive tools worse. So those types of decks are can be strong into fatigue decks. Same with the setup-based decks like Dash, if you're building the pistol items. Which is why in the past, or Icelander in the past with the Frost Hex kind of setup. Same concept. Which is why when I played Ultim to second place at the Calling Indianapolis last year, this fatigue style deck, I played Imperial Warhorn, which was just exclusively a way to answer these Frost Hexes and items out of Dash. It wasn't very efficient because you could only have one of, and it took a turn to play it, a turn to destroy it, and then I had to cast Remembrance and then draw it again. But you had to do what you had to do. And it kind of worked out. So that is like one way of beating fatigue decks. But that requires a very specific style of deck. And so what if you're not playing Illusionist? Or what if you're not playing Mechanologist or Wizard? Well, the way for other decks to beat it is you need to really maximize the amount of damage that you push through all at once. And what that means is you can't just say every turn you look at your hand and say, I can attack for 12 with this hand, or 12 or 14, or whatever number your 4 cards can attack with, and then just attack with that amount. That's a losing strategy. That is exactly what a fatigue deck wants you to do, is to just play your 4 cards, pass, play your 4 cards, pass, play your 4 cards, pass. That is the way you lose very quickly against a fatigue deck. And the way you beat it with these style decks, your typical things like Fi or KO now, or even the warriors like Kasai, is you want to set up individual big turns. And you want to have these peaks of like one massive turn where you use Art of War and Mask of Pouncing Lynx, and you have maybe your Snapdragons for multiple kind of combo enders there, like Lava Burst and whatnot. And you push through a ton of damage at once, and then you take a few turns where you're kind of setting up, right? Where you arsenal a card, maybe you make a less efficient attack than you could, just because you want to hold back that Lava Burst in your hand for when you know you can get the most value out of it. And being okay with doing that, being okay with playing a little slower. Same with if you're playing something like KO, one of the new heroes who likes playing Cast Bones, which is a really good tool to like set up. You can build up a whole bunch of might tokens. And that lets you say, well, this turn I'm not going to attack you at all, really. I'm going to play Cast Bones, I'm going to make some might tokens, and then next turn, I'm going to attack you for like 25 or something, some much higher number. And then the fatigue deck is now kind of stranded with some cards on the turn you didn't attack them, and is getting overloaded on the turns when you do attack them. And so over those 2 turns, right, the setup and the payoff, you're going to do more damage if you load all of your damage into one turn and do a little bit less on the previous turn than if you had done kind of an equal amount both turns.
Yeah. I think talking about Fi when countering fatigue is a really good example here too, because Fi also has these tools that can block. You have the Flamescale Furnace, you have the Tiger Stripe Shuko, and even when you want to set up a turn where you are arsenaling an Art of War, and with Bravo you are coming with a Crippling Crush, for example, even when it's dominated, you can trade in this equipment and maybe give up one of your cards from hand, but then being able to push through with this massive damage turn in the next round even.
Yeah, exactly. Just the flexibility to be able to have those arsenals and to block out the disruptive attack is really invaluable, because that's how the fatigue decks know that that's what you want to do, is you want to do this setup and then big payoff turn. And so they're going to try to come at you with some disruptive attacks when you set up, and just being able to, you know, do a minimum investment to counter that, like use some armor, or maybe block with just one card that you might not have been able to use that efficiently anyway, and then still attack back is very strong.
Yeah, and when talking about countering fatigue, I think it's even a question before that. How can I know that I want to counter fatigue? And that is when looking at the meta stats, at those tier lists, and at the last big tournament where you could see what decks were actually played. That is a really good question to ask yourself, I think, when thinking about, do I need to counter fatigue, and then learning how to counter it.
Yeah, definitely agree. That's it. It comes from a little bit of what you expect in the metagame and how popular you think these style of decks is going to be. I think historically that much like some other niche decks like Kano, for instance, fatigue strategies have been maybe underrepresented based compared to how strong they actually are, because players just don't like playing as it. And, you know, it is a kind of an off, you know, it's not your normal strategy. And so less players are probably going to be fully dedicated to this style than maybe the power level of the deck warrant. But it's still important to consider, especially when I think Warriors got a pretty big boost. And so you might see more people playing Decimate or Great Axe now with heavy hitters. Obviously, Bravo got some boost because Guardians did. So you might see more Bravo in that strategy. So I think it might be picking up a little bit. And so it's always worth having an idea that this might be what you end up playing against. And having a game plan in mind is very important if you want to do well at big tournaments.
And there might also even be some specific cards that you can think about when building your deck for these tournaments where you're thinking about countering fatigue. One card that I specifically think of was Nasty Surprise. I think the spoiler card that I got. I don't think it's really played at the moment, but I think that is a tool that LSS gives us now to think about, okay, when you are getting hit with a disruptive attack, even from a fatigue deck like Bravo, for example, then you get some value off of the card that is now taken away from you.
Yeah, absolutely. I love Nasty Surprise. I think that card has a ton of potential, especially in a deck like Fi. I think that's where it's probably at its best. It's a card you can just put in your arsenal, and then if they try to command and conquer you, you're like, that's great, I will just take it. And then suddenly you get a bunch of tokens, right? Like, I did what I thought was a disruptive attack, and it actually was totally fine for you. And maybe it was even beneficial for you because you really wanted those tokens. So that's one really good option. I think Fi also got another great tool in Tenacity, the yellow attack that is... that
it's
punishes...
a zero cost, right?
Yeah, it's a zero cost that gets +1 attack for every defending card on the combat chain. So, especially on your really big turns, right? These turns when your opponent is blocking with their armor because they're trying to block out the, on hits or something, they could easily have, 4 cards from their hand blocking, maybe 1 or 2 pieces of equipment, maybe even a 5th card blocking, right? If they play a D-React out of Arsenal. And then suddenly this tenacity is getting plus 5, 6, plus 7 damage, right? It's a massive, like, 1 card text for 8 or 9 damage on these big turns, and that is absolutely huge to really push through and punch through defenses fatigue decks.
Yeah, definitely. It's even when you think about heroes that are gaining some cards, like Victor gets to draw a card in some situations, and then you're getting even more value from a card like Tenacity. But is there any other card that you can think of that players could consider?
Yeah, I think for some decks that aren't super streamlined aggro decks like Fi, so other decks might consider even something like Remembrance. It's a little weird because those decks don't want to play a long game, and Remembrance is kind of a weak card on its own merits for those aggressive decks. But if you know you're playing against a Fatigue deck, and you just shuffle back in 3 of your kind of power cards, that's really scary because a Fatigue deck is trying to run you out of resources, and if you're, say, a Brute that shuffles back in 3 Bloodrush Bellows, that is terrifying for a Fatigue deck. That is terrifying. Same with like if Dromai plays Remembrance and they shuffle back in like 3 Chromais, right? Like Chromai can be hard to deal with, or Miragai, or any of their really threatening dragons. Just having some more power cards in your deck is a strong strategy when my whole goal is to run you out of power cards.
Yeah. So there, when speaking about Brood shuffling back their Bloodrush Bellows, there's even another Brood distinctive card that's called Dig Up Dinner. It's not really a card that is loved, I would say, but it's definitely a card to consider when playing, because you can shuffle back your 6 attacks and even your generic 6s, but you're also gaining a little bit of life off when shuffling back.
Yeah, I think Dig Up Dinner, it's kind of like Remembrance Light, right? But it has better, failure state, I would say, because it's a blue, it blocks 3. So even if you're not actually casting it, it's still totally fine. Whereas Remembrance is a yellow that doesn't block, so it's much worse if you don't want to use it for its effect. I think Dig Up Dinner is something that, if Fatigue decks start getting more popular, then Dig Up Dinner is probably a reasonable inclusion in some of the Brute decks. But if you're playing something like Rhinar, you're probably just fine in Fatigue anyway. Because Rhinar can Intimidate, which means Fatigue decks don't get to do their blocking as well. So maybe Dig Up Dinner is a card for like Levia. Probably not in KO, because KO really wants to maximize his number of attacks and not his non-attacks. But yeah, that's totally a consideration. Kind of talking about Levia did make me think, just having an end game kind of recursion, a way of getting constant value. Levia can do this through some setup with Deep-Rooted Evil and something like Howl from Below. I think that's what it's called. Some of the blood deck cards that you can cast from Banish. This allows you to kind of perpetually attack and lose kind of a minimum amount of cards out of your deck and still attack for a large amount. And you end up out-fatiguing the Fatigue deck because you are getting a lot of value out of just like 1 card out of deck to still attack for a large amount, which is probably going to cost the Fatigue deck 2 or 3 cards to block out. And Fi can even do this too, with recurring his Phoenix Flame and buffing up with Tiger Stripe Shuko and swinging his weapon every turn. Like, he can get 5-ish damage without using a card out of deck, just a pitch card to play the Phoenix Flame, swing the sword every turn. And it depends on exactly how defensive they've been and how the matchup goes, but a Fi deck can potentially out-fatigue a Fatigue deck with enough recursive damage at the end of the game.
Yeah, that is what we saw at the Calling Antwerp last year, where a lot of Fi players were facing either Oldhim or Bravo, and I even know a lot of Bravo players that are struggling or have struggled to win against Fi because, like you said, he has this resource in his graveyard that he can just recur every turn if he likes to. And then also it is really, really struggling to counter these really big Art of War turns with a lot of cards on the chain and even potential Mask of Pouncelings.
Yeah, it has the potential to burst you out for a ton of damage and then still have that late game. That's very valuable.
So at the moment, there is actually a calling going on in Europe in Liverpool. And I think, if I'm right, a teammate of yours is in the top 8, right?
Yes, Naib. Naib is a teammate of mine, a good friend that I've known for a while. I believe he was like number 3 seed going to the top 8. And as we're recording this, I think the top 8 is being played out. So I don't know how he's doing. Really pulling for him to take this one down.
Yeah, definitely shout outs to him. And when considering in the future if you want to play Fatigue or not, or when you want to learn it, I really hope that this conversation of Charles and me talking about Fatigue helps you. If you have any questions left, drop them down in the comments, and definitely like the video if it helps you. Here at the end, not at the beginning, I want to spoil the next episode that is coming after this, and that is actually where I will talk to Michael Hamilton and Brody Spurlock about the learnings of Team Wolfpack from the last year and them taking those learnings into the next year. So definitely subscribe to the podcast if you want to hear this. But Charles, here at the end, do you want to shout at anyone?
I just shout out my entire testing team, the Fabled Runaways. Got a big team. We've been doing really well this season at the 2 callings that have already happened. So hopefully we can keep that momentum up and hopefully take down Pro Tour LA.
I wish you best of luck for this, and thank you so much for taking the time and coming here on the Fabled Academy podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been great.